Welcome back. If you're like us, you want to get straight to the heart of things, especially complex stuff like fame and how people react to it. You want the real insights, fast, no fluff.
Exactly. And today we're diving into something really interesting.
Yeah, it's this idea from a text we looked at, let's just call it the source text, that suggests maybe fanboys and haters aren't so different after all.
It's a bit counterintuitive, right? That intense love and intense hate might actually stem from a similar place. That's what we're going to unpack today.
So this source text, it was originally written for startup founders, people suddenly getting a lot more attention.
That's right. But the ideas about fanboys and haters, well, they apply much more widely. Anyone who finds themselves getting noticed, really.
Okay, so our mission here is to understand these reactions, the super positive, the super negative, and explore this surprising connection the text draws between them.
Precisely. Understanding the nature of these reactions and how the text says we should maybe think about them.
All right, let's start with the basics. Definitions. How does the source text describe a fanboy?
Well, it's not just a regular fan, someone who likes your work.
Yeah.
It's deeper, more intense.
How so?
The text says their liking becomes like a core part of their identity. They're described as obsessive, and this is key, uncritical.
Uncritical. So they don't see any flaws.
Pretty much. They build up this idealized image, almost like a caricature, where everything the famous person does is just brilliant, perfect even.
Okay.
And there's this strong urge, this need almost, to tell everyone how great this person is, to broadcast their admiration.
Right. I can see how that might feel good initially, a bit of an ego boost. But the text implies there's a downside to fame, a less pleasant side.
Ah, yes. That brings us to the haters.
And the description here is, well, it's kind of striking, isn't it?
It really is. The text defines a hater in almost the exact same terms. They're also obsessive, also uncritical.
But instead of liking, it's their disliking that becomes part of their identity.
Exactly. They construct an equally unrealistic but negative image. Everything the target does is viewed as bad or wrong or stupid.
Wow.
And just like the fanboy wants to broadcast admiration, the hater feels compelled to broadcast their negativity, their dislike.
So this is the core aha moment in the text, isn't it? That these descriptions are basically mirror images.
Absolutely. You just take the fanboy description, flip the positive words to negative ones, like admiration becomes negativity, good becomes bad, and you essentially have the description of a hater.
That's pretty profound, actually.
Right.
Because you naturally think they're polar opposites.
Right. You think, okay, dealing with obsessive fans is one thing, maybe annoying but flattering, but dealing with haters feels totally different, much worse.
But the text is saying, structurally, psychologically maybe,
Yeah.
they're coming from a similar place.
That's the argument. The text puts it really bluntly. Haters are just fanboys with the sign switched.
Fanboys with the sign switched. Okay.
It highlights that same obsessive, uncritical foundation, just pointed in the opposite direction.
Now, we should probably clarify, when the text talks about haters, it's not just anyone who disagrees or leaves a critical comment online, is it?
No, definitely not. That's a really important distinction the author makes. They're not talking about casual trolls or people with, legitimate criticisms.
So who are they talking about?
It's a smaller group. People for whom disliking a specific famous person becomes a real long-term preoccupation. Almost a hobby, but a negative one.
Like a sustained campaign.
Exactly. It's not just a fleeting annoyance. It's this persistent, focused negativity towards one individual.
Okay. And what does the text say causes this? Why do these haters emerge? Is it something the famous person does?
Well, partly, but the text links it directly to the fame itself. It says haters are, quote, energized by the fame of their target.
Energized by the fame. How does that work?
Think about it. If some unknown person does something you dislike, you probably just ignore them, right? Move on.
Yeah, probably wouldn't even register.
But if a really famous person does the exact same thing, their very visibility, the fact that everyone's talking about them, that fame can somehow amplify the negative reaction in certain people.
So the fame acts like fuel for the fire, in a way.
Kind of. It makes the target a bigger target. The dislike gets magnified because the person is already so prominent.
And this connects to another key idea in the text, what it calls the spectral signature of a hater, which is
The perception that the famous person is a fraud.
a fraud. Why specifically a fraud?
It's fascinating. The text argues that the hater sees the fame. They might even exaggerate it. They know the person is successful, widely admired, maybe rich.
Okay.
But they also believe the person has no real talent or merit or is fundamentally bad. So there's this clash, this cognitive dissonance. How can someone they see as undeserving be so famous?
So fraud is the explanation they land on.
Exactly. It resolves the conflict. The person must have tricked everyone. They're faking it. They've pulled the wool over the public's eyes. That's how the hater makes sense of the fame they can't deny, alongside the lack of merit they perceive.
That actually makes a strange kind of sense. It's a way to reconcile those conflicting views.
It is. It bridges the gap between the objective reality of the person's fame and the hater's subjective negative assessment.
Does the text say anything about who is more likely to become this kind of hater? Are there common characteristics?
It suggests, cautiously, that haters often have a sense of being, quote, losers in a very specific sense.
Losers. That sounds harsh. What does that mean?
It doesn't necessarily mean they lack talent entirely. They might be quite capable in some ways. But it means they haven't achieved significant public recognition or success themselves, especially in a field related to the person they hate.
So there might be an element of jealousy or resentment.
Possibly. The text mentions this idea of frustrated talent, someone who feels they should have been recognized, and they resent seeing someone else who they deem less worthy achieve that success.
Why them and not me? Sort of feeling.
Precisely. And the text adds an interesting point. Someone who has achieved significant fame themselves is less likely to see another famous person as a total fraud.
Why that?
Because they understand that fame isn't always directly proportional to merit.
Yeah.
They know there's luck involved, timing, connections. It's complex. They're less likely to jump to the "they must be faking it" conclusion.
Right, they have a more nuanced view of how success happens.
Exactly. So this sense of personal non-achievement, perhaps combined with perceived talent, seems to be a potential ingredient, according to the text.
The text even talks about a hypothetical cure for haters.
Oh.
Right, like what if they achieve their own success?
Yeah. But the author is pretty pessimistic about that.
Oh.
They basically say it's a moot point because, in their view, these kinds of obsessive haters never will achieve great work.
Never will. That's quite definitive.
It is. The suggestion is almost a two-way street. Maybe the obsessive negativity itself prevents the kind of focus and positive energy needed for great accomplishment.
So the hating hinders the doing.
And perhaps the lack of doing fuels the hating. It's presented as this kind of locked-in cycle. The text implies that people who do achieve great things generally don't have the time or inclination for that kind of sustained obsessive negativity towards others.
It's a bit bleak, but it fits the overall picture of obsession.
It does. And what I found really humanizing was the author's own reflection on this.
What do they say?
They mentioned being able to imagine being a huge fanboy, using P.G. Wodehouse as an example. That feeling of intense admiration for someone's work, they got that.
Okay, relatable.
But then they say very clearly, I could not imagine being a hater. Like, that specific mindset of sustained obsessive dislike was just incomprehensible to them on a personal level.
Which really underlines how different that negative obsession feels, even if it shares structural similarities with positive obsession.
Exactly. It adds a personal weight to the analysis.
So bringing this all together, what's the practical upshot for someone listening who might be experiencing more attention, more fans, and maybe some haters too? How does understanding this fanboy-hater connection actually help?
Well, the text argues it actually simplifies things.
Simplifies. How? Dealing with hate seems complicated?
Because if haters are basically fanboys with the sign switched,
Yeah.
you don't necessarily need a whole separate strategy for them. The advice boils down to something surprisingly simple.
Which is?
Simply not to think much about them.
Just ignore them.
Yeah.
That sounds hard when the negativity feels so personal.
It is hard. The text acknowledges the natural reaction is often confusion, maybe hurt. You see this intense dislike directed at you, and you want to understand why. What did I do?
Right, you want to fix it or defend yourself, maybe engage with them.
Exactly. You might treat it like a normal disagreement where you can reason with the person, explain your side.
But the text says that's usually a mistake with this specific type of hater.
Yes, because their reaction often isn't rooted in a specific rational grievance about something you actually did, not in a way that warrants that level of obsessive negativity. It's fueled by their internal state, their perception, their obsession.
So engaging is like trying to reason with an obsession.
Pretty much.
Hmm.
The text uses the fanboy analogy again. You probably don't spend hours psychoanalyzing why your biggest fanboys adore you so intensely, right?
No, probably not. You'd likely just appreciate the sentiment, maybe feel a bit weirded out if it's too intense, and move on.
And the advice is to adopt a similar stance towards haters. Acknowledge the negativity exists, perhaps, but don't get drawn into analyzing its roots or trying to fix the hater's perception.
So even if there was some trigger event, the reaction is disproportionate and comes more from them than from the event itself.
That's the idea. It's kind of like saying it's not really about you, it's about them. Their intense negativity, like the fanboy's intense positivity, says more about their own psychology than it does about your actual qualities or actions.
Don't overthink the praise, don't overthink the hate, just focus on your work.
That seems to be the core practical advice derived from this analysis.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for our listeners.
Yeah.
The big takeaway from our deep dive into this source text is what?
I'd say it's that really surprising connection. The idea that these extreme opposites, the adoring fanboy and the obsessive hater, might actually share a fundamental structure. Both obsessive, both uncritical, just pointed differently. The hate is like the love, just with the sign flipped.
And understanding that connection, that underlying similarity, changes how you might think about dealing with both. Less confusion, maybe less hurt from the haters, if you see it as a phenomenon related to fame itself, rather than purely a reaction to you personally.
Exactly. It offers a framework for interpreting these often baffling reactions.
Which leads to a final thought, maybe something for our listeners to chew on. If this flipped sign dynamic exists with fame, where else might we see it?
Ooh, interesting question.
Like, think about really polarized debates. Politics, maybe. Social issues. Even intense personal disagreements. Could seemingly opposite entrenched viewpoints sometimes share similar underlying psychological drivers, just expressed differently?
Like an uncritical, obsessive attachment to one side, mirrored by an equally uncritical, obsessive rejection of the other.
Yeah. Could recognizing that potential pattern, that flip sign, give us a new lens to understand why communication breaks down, why people seem locked into opposing camps? It's just a thought, something maybe worth considering.
Definitely food for thought. But ultimately, for anyone navigating public attention, the insights from this text offer a potentially powerful tool. Understanding the fanboy-hater dynamic, this idea of the flipped sign, can hopefully equip you to handle those extremes with a bit more perspective and maybe a little less distress.
A valuable framework indeed. Thanks for unpacking that with us today.
My pleasure. Always interesting stuff.